Hello, and welcome to my video on cultural competence. I'm Dr. Dana Haggard, Professor of Management and curator of this video. I'm also the photographer for this picture. My husband and I visited Tokyo on our wedding anniversary a few years ago and accidentally crashed a wedding procession in one of the beautiful temple parks. I am a big fan of learning about other cultures, and consequently this video is one of the longer ones in this class. So settle in and let's get started. Before we jump into a definition of cultural competence, let's spend a little time defining culture or cultural values. We will talk about personal values in a separate video. Here you see 3 definitions of cultural values. The first comes from Collins Dictionary. The moral principles and beliefs or accepted standards of a person or a social group. Unpacking that, it's basically what you think is right and wrong and what is acceptable and not acceptable as behavior, either at the personal level or in the social group. As I said, we'll talk about personal values in a separate video. BusinessTerms.org defines cultural values as a set of beliefs or ideas that a community or society upholds as being important. This could be on the level of an entire hemisphere, Eastern culture versus Western culture, an ethnic group, black versus white, or a specific sector or subculture of society, which can also include corporate culture, in other words, the values of a particular industry or company. The last definition listed here is from businessdictionary.com. The commonly held standards of what is acceptable or unacceptable, important or unimportant, right or wrong, workable or unworkable, etc., in a community or society. All of these definitions hit on 2 basic things. 1, values are about what's important and what people think is right and wrong, and we're talking about this at the group level. So this is a shared belief among large numbers of people. While these definitions might make it sound like a person is a member of only one cultural group, it's more accurate to think of people as belonging to multiple cultural groups. Some of those groups have more overlap, though, than others. Let's talk next about values at the national level. That's one of the larger ways, that's one of the broader descriptions of culture. We're going to talk about 2, Hofstede and Tropenhaars. If you have studied culture before, then you have likely heard of Hofstede's model of national culture. He has an awesome website for students who are interested in learning more, and I have included the link in the Sources and Additional Resources section of this video. You can listen to the man himself explain the definitions there if you'd like, but here are the basics from his website. According to Hofstede, individualism is the extent to which people feel independent as opposed to being interdependent as members of larger wholes. Individualism means that individual choices and decisions are expected. Collectivism means that one knows one's place in life, which is determined socially. So in an individualistic culture, children might be expected to decide for themselves whom to marry or what career to pursue. But in more collectivistic societies, the child would be seen as a member of the group, and the group would have some influence on the decision and choices the child makes. Power distance is the extent to which the less powerful members of an organization and institutions, like family, accept and expect that power is distributed unequally. Thinking of it in terms of social hierarchy, those on the bottom of the ladder accept that they have less power than those higher in the social structure. Within families, children see and accept that the elders have more power in the relationship. Remember, power distance is defined from the perspective of the person at the bottom, not at the person at the top. In masculine societies, there are clearly defined gender roles and expectations for each of the sexes. Also, in masculine societies, competition and winning is more important, whereas in more feminine societies, cooperation is considered the better option and caring about others is more emphasized. Uncertainty avoidance we've already talked about a little bit at the individual level. Uncertainty avoidance at the cultural level has to do with the anxiety and distrust in the face of the unknown, and also with the wish to have fixed habits and rituals and to know the truth as opposed to knowing many truths. In long-term orientation cultures, there's a priority on thinking about and planning for the future and less of an emphasis on the past. In short-term orientation cultures, past tradition is very important and it should be used as a moral compass for the future. Lastly, we have indulgence. Indulgence is about the good things in life and the freedom to enjoy them. Friends are important, as is following what your heart wants to do. The opposite of an indulgent culture is a restrained culture. In a restrained culture, the feeling is that life is hard and duty, not freedom, is the normal state of being. In indulgent cultures, you are more likely to see parents giving children lavish gifts and parties than you would in a restrained culture. Hofstede is, of course, not the only scholar who has studied culture. Trompenaars has also examined values at the societal level, and he describes 7 dimensions of culture. He has a video you can watch where he explains each of them. However, I have summarized them for you here. You can find the link to his video in the Sources and Additional Resources section of this video. As we walk through Trompenaars' dimensions, you'll see that there is some conceptual overlap in some of them with Hofstede. Both scholars would be happy to tell you that there are probably many other ways to describe culture, and would not argue that their model is the only possible model. So, let's start with the first dimension for Trompenaars, universalism versus particularism. In looking at universalism and particularism, we're looking at what governs behavior. So, in universalistic societies, societal rules govern behavior within relationships. Whereas in particularistic societies, rules in the relationships govern behavior. So look at it this way. If you had a friend who was accused of cheating and you found out they'd done it, in a universalistic society, your knowledge that they had done something that had broken the society's rules would impact how you behaved, and that would govern what you did. In a particularistic society, what would be more important is your relationship with your friend, and that would be what drove your decision to do anything about the cheating, rather than the fact that it went against society's rules. In individualism and collectivism, we see reflections of what we'd seen already in Hofstede's model. In individualistic societies, the individual is emphasized, whereas in collectivistic societies, the group is emphasized. The next dimension is an interesting one, and then it talks about how emotions are displayed. In affective cultures, emotions are openly displayed, and you can see this quite clearly. People are very free with their gestures and their facial expressions and what they say about how they feel. Whereas in neutral countries or in neutral cultures, rationality is expected rather than emotional displays. So in affective cultures, you would see people hugging and kissing and shaking hands and being affectionate, and when they're angry, you would see them gesturing, and you could see it on their face, and they would be loud. Whereas in neutral cultures, what's going to be expected is more a withholding of emotions. So rather than displaying how you feel, you're expected to hide or suppress that emotional reaction and instead focus on rationality and calmness. Then we have specificity versus diffuse. This has to do with the roles in your life and how they are either separated or integrated. In specific cultures, there's a very careful separation of roles in life. So your work life is very separated from your home life and from your friendships. Whereas in diffuse cultures, there's an integration of roles in life. So you may have a lot more friendships that overlap with people that you work with, or a lot of people that you maybe are friends with are also related to you. Whereas in specific societies, there are different and highly defined specialized roles, and people don't like to mix those. Whereas in diffuse cultures, people don't have a problem knowing people in multiple contexts. So in a specific society, if someone at work were to ask you to go out and spend time together, have a drink, go out to dinner or something like that, they would probably say no, because there's a very hard line between what happens at work versus what happens socially. Whereas in diffuse cultures, you'll see people who often have many friends at work and they do things outside of work together, and you would not see that in specific cultures. The next dimension is concerned with status within society. In an achievement culture, status is derived from personal accomplishments. It's basically you are valued for what you can do, regardless of who you are or where you came from. This is different than an ascription culture. In an ascription culture, status comes from who you are or what title you hold. So it's much more difficult to increase your status in an ascription culture than it is in an achievement culture. In an achievement culture, you can increase your skills, increase what you can do, and your status rises. In an ascription culture, people remember who you are and where you come from, and so that overrides any personal accomplishments. The next thing has to do with time. Sequential time versus synchronous time. In sequential time, events are expected to happen in order and on time, and plans are expected to be kept. This is different than in synchronous time. In synchronous time, plans and commitments are seen as flexible. The last dimension is internal direction versus external direction, and this will sound a lot like locus of control. Internal direction cultures believe that individuals are in control of their own environment and destinies. So the idea is people can shape their environment to achieve their goals. This is as opposed to external direction. In an external direction culture, nature or the environment is in control, and individuals must work with the environment and others in order to achieve their goals. There's a great tool or a great web page on Mind Tools that looks at Trump and our 7 dimensions of culture and tips on how to behave or what things to do if you find yourself dealing with someone from each of these different cultural dimensions. As always, you can find that link in the sources and additional resources section of this video. Now that we have defined cultural values and have a better understanding of how cultures differ in what they value, we'll move on to the definition of cultural competence. Here are 2 definitions that I think are good at describing the concept. First, from the APA Dictionary of Psychology, the capacity to function effectively in cultural settings other than one's own. This usually involves a recognition of the diversity both between and within cultures, a capacity for cultural self-assessment, and a willingness to adapt personal behaviors and practices. So, several important things in this definition. First is the idea of functioning effectively. In other words, if you're operating in another culture, that you can be able to get along and get your agenda accomplished. So what did you need to do, and were you able to accomplish those things? It also looks at the fact that there is diversity both between and within cultures. So we've already talked about how cultures may differ from one another, and a lot of times there is this it's just a human thing to do, and that is to assume that people from other cultures are more similar to each other than you are with people within your own culture. So, for instance, in the United States, we think of there being distinct differences from people who live in the New England area and people who live in New York versus people who live in Texas or Florida or Montana, and differences even, again, between those places and California. And so we're very quick to point out that there are differences within our own culture, but when we talk to someone from another culture, we have the tendency to expect that everyone from that culture is similar to one another. And so that would be that would be an area of cultural competence that people need to work on, is understanding that although there are differences between the US and other countries, that within those countries, there's also variability and significant differences within the cultures and subcultures. Also, this idea of cultural self-assessment, so being able to be aware of what your own perceptions of culture are, and of course, a willingness to adapt your behavior and practices. So it's not just enough to be aware of the differences and know those differences exist, but there has to be a willingness to adapt how you behave in order to operate effectively in these other cultural settings. Then we have definitions.net. And according to definitions.net, cultural competence is an ability to interact effectively with people of different cultures and socioeconomic backgrounds. Cultural competence comprises 4 components: awareness of one's own cultural worldview, attitude toward cultural differences, knowledge of different cultural practices and worldviews, and cross-cultural skills. So let's look at this as opposed to the previous definition. You can see that interaction or functioning effectively with different cultures is an aspect of both of those. I like the definitions.net one because it also incorporates the idea of socioeconomic backgrounds. So there are differences within cultures based on those issues. And so it's important to be able to talk with and interact with people of all socioeconomic backgrounds. Also, I really like the 4 dimensions or 4 components of cultural competence that are mentioned in this particular definition. Awareness of one's own cultural worldview, which kind of gets back to the idea of that capacity for cultural self-assessment. So being aware of your own culture and how your own culture is different from others. Attitude towards cultural differences. So what do you think of when you think about those differences? Do you automatically think, well, my way or our way is better? Or are you open to the idea that maybe other cultures do things better than we do? Knowledge of different cultural practices and worldviews, so being aware of what exactly those differences are, and cross-cultural skills, so being able to actually operate within those contexts successfully. And like I said, what I like about both of these definitions is they do not limit culture to being uniform across a country. I also like that both list the need for recognizing awareness of one's own culture as a necessity. So now that we've defined cultural competence, let's move on. Using those definitions as a foundation and building on it, let's talk about what cultural competence requires. We have already covered cultural self-awareness, non-judgmental attitudes towards cultural differences, and knowledge of cultural differences. In addition, cultural competence requires tact and diplomacy. Someone who is tactful is socially aware and sensitive in dealing with delicate situations. They are able to communicate without giving offense. A diplomat is someone who can achieve peaceful resolution or facilitate discussion without causing ill will. So tact and diplomacy both involve sensitivity and communication skills. Perspective taking involves imagining the situation from the viewpoint of the other person. In other words, putting yourself in their shoes. And finally, intercultural interaction is actually interacting with people of other cultures. It's difficult to acquire cultural competence without ever having interacted with someone from another culture. So we have talked quite a bit about what culture is and what cultural competence is. So why is it worth all this talk and this time? Well, understanding cultural values is important because our cultural values can influence our perceptions, thoughts, attitudes, and behaviors. Our values determine what we prioritize, and the interesting thing about cultural values is that we are usually unaware of them until we come into contact with people from another culture. It's then that we realize that not everyone sees the world the way that we do. It's also important to have cultural competence because people belong to multiple cultural groups. and it's important to understand that we shouldn't make assumptions about them based on obvious demographic observations. Cultural values also influence organizational culture, leadership styles, decision-making processes, the way jobs are designed, and how people are motivated. All very important things to corporate success. And differences in values can be a source of misunderstandings and conflict. Therefore, cultural competence is important because cultural competence increases trust and credibility, helps to reduce tensions and conflict in diverse work groups so they can perform better, and it improves the ability to operate internationally. We live in a small world that is shrinking all the time. We can all probably name at least a few people we know from either different national cultures or different subcultures within our own country. Knowing how to be respectful of each other's culture will help our relationships with these individuals and other members of those groups. We know that cultural competence is important for ourselves as well as for our organizations. What are some ways that cultural competence can be measured? Here are a few websites you can check out to see how culturally competent you are. As always, I recommend taking more than one, and you can always Google around to find other measures. And now to the best part, improving cultural competence. What we're going to talk about here are those 6 requirements that I mentioned earlier for cultural competence. We'll start with cultural self-awareness. The first thing you can do is what we just mentioned, and that is to take a cultural competence survey. Actually, as always, I recommend that you take multiple ones so that you can kind of see what kind of questions are asked, and it might reveal to you which area you need to work on most when it comes to developing cultural competence. Also, you could look up the Hofstede and Trempenaars culture scores for your country and other countries and ask yourself if that profile matches your personal values. You could also ask a friend from another culture or just an acquaintance to rate you on your cultural competence. Sometimes people who are just acquaintances might have better insight into your cultural competence than people who are close to you, because close friends can sometimes be more forgiving than people you've just met. In order to work on developing a non-judgmental attitude towards cultural differences, remember that your culture is only one of many in this world. Also, remember that once you hear the why for why something happens in a particular culture, the difference will likely seem logical. That's not always the case, but a lot of times the idea is just that things have evolved differently due to different environments. To improve your knowledge of other cultures, get to know people from different cultures. That's the first thing you can do. Make friends with people in your class that you can tell aren't from where you're from. Also, watch videos, read books, talk to people, and my favorite, travel. Nothing helps you appreciate another culture quite like travel does. Travel also helps you gain an appreciation for your own culture. So how can you work on your perspective taking? Well, try watching a movie or reading a book told from the perspective of a person from another culture. Imagine what it would have been like to grow up in another culture. How would that have affected your life? How would things be different for you now? Then, intercultural interaction. That's another thing you can work on quite easily. Take advantage of opportunities to interact with people from other cultures. So when you see someone in class, or you see someone at work, or someone in your neighborhood, and you can tell they're not from your culture, strike up a conversation with them and see if you can develop a relationship with them. They can learn from you, and you can learn from them. Attend cultural events. This was one of my favorites. The picture you see here is of me with one of my students. She was the director and one of the organizers of the Missouri State University Traditional Chinese Dance Show a few years ago. I loved going to the show. It was so much fun to watch and to see the different aspects of culture. And in this case, we're talking about what I would consider high culture, things like dance and art and those kinds of things. But I also really enjoy learning about the cultural the everyday culture. So going to supermarkets when I travel and seeing what different products are on offer, that's something I also enjoy. Related to that, another thing that you can do here or wherever you are is to visit restaurants or stores run by people from other cultures for people from other cultures. In other words, you don't want to go to a restaurant that might be owned by someone from a foreign country or from a different culture, but it's tailored basically to cater to customers from your culture. What you want to do is try to find a place that is set up for and run by people of other cultures. And you go and you visit those places and you look at what's on the shelves, you look at what's on the menu, you buy things, you order things, and you talk to the people who work there. And there's a lot you can learn from those experiences. Now, moving on to tact and diplomacy. Tact and diplomacy, first thing you need to think about is, of course, to think before you speak. Process what you're going to say and think about how it would sound to that other person before you actually say it. And choose your words carefully. There's some words in our language that have very different meanings than the translated word in the other language. And so you need to be aware of those possibilities and just choose your words carefully and make sure when you're talking that your tone of voice and your facial expressions and your gestures are appropriate for the interaction. Also, as I think I've mentioned earlier, there is a Mind Tools webpage that you can visit that does a great job of talking through cultural competence types of issues. Here are some questions for self-reflection. When is the last time you met someone from a different culture than yours? Was it a positive or negative experience? Why? What are the first thoughts you have when you discover something different about another culture? When you see an advertisement for a cultural event, what is your first reaction? When is the last time you traveled to a place with a different culture or subculture than yours? That concludes this video on cultural competence. I hope you found the information to be useful and interesting. If you have any questions about topics from this video, please post them to the Student Questions discussion board in Blackboard. Chances are, if you have a question, another student has that question too. And if you're intellectually curious and would like to know more, please stay tuned for the sources and additional resources slide for this video. Thanks for listening.